Okay, so we can't go too much further without actually talking about the number one aspect of money, which is compound interest. I mean, we can't have a training about money and not talk about compound interest, right? So let's dive into that before we get any further into this course. And in this lesson, I want to actually talk about the myths behind compound interest, because all of us can probably relate, and this is a great lesson to show your kids, but all of us can probably relate to that time that we actually sat down with a compound interest calculator to try to figure out how we were going to be a millionaire, right? So if your goal is to someday have this future value of $1 million, not 10 million, that would be nice too, but let's just say $1 million. If your goal is to save enough money to have $1 million, and maybe you're 40 years old, and so you've got or 45, and you got 20 more years. Let's just look at 20 years. And let's just say that you think you can conservatively earn about 5%. This is going to tell you how much money you have to save each year at 5% interest to get that $1 million. And it's almost $29,000. Have you ever done this and had that reality where you're like, holy cow, there's no way I'm going to be able to save that much money? So what's the first thing that we all do is you start playing with this number right here, right? You're like, well, what if I could get an 8%? I mean, 5% is pretty conservative. I could probably get 8%, right? Wow, that's still $20,000 a year that I have to save. Man, I'm never going to retire. I'm never going to be able to make this work. But, what if, I don't know, what if maybe, I don't know, I'm willing to take on more risk. I've got 20 years, right? So what if I could get a 12% return? That's about $1,000 a month. That's maybe doable. I mean, it's going to hurt. It's going to definitely cut into lifestyle expenses, but maybe I could figure out how to save $1,000 a month for the next 20 years if I could actually get to have my $1 million and finally retire. This is something that we have all done. The minute we learn about compound interest, we start playing with some of these numbers. And when we're investing, we're always trying to find investments that pay higher returns, right? So I want to talk about some of these myths. So actually, let's take a look at how this looks. Let's take this and play it out. Here we have our $12,000. I got to reset. Oops. Let's reset that. All right. Here's my 12% every year for all of these years to where I finally reach my goal of $1 million. There we have it, right? There's the 20 years, and there's $1,000 a month roughly, a little bit more at 12% interest, and we're gonna finally have our $1 million. Now, what could possibly go wrong, right? Well, what if there's a couple, like right here, and right here, and right here, and right here? What if there's 4 times, right, 4 years in those 20 years where you actually lose 12% instead of gaining 12%, right? Have you ever had a year where you actually lose money? Now, for some people who are young that haven't started saving money yet, you might think you're invincible and that you're never going to lose any money. That only happens to your parents, right? But we're all eventually at one point in time in our life going to experience what it's like to lose a bit of money. Just recently with the whole COVID, we had a nice little crash the minute they announced the COVID virus that was out. In March and April of that year, it just dropped and we lost a lot more than 12%. In 2007 and through 2008, from top to bottom, the market dropped about 56%. And in 2000 to 2002, with the dot-com crash and 9/11 in there, we actually lost about 46%. Okay? So now if you're really good and you avoided some of those losses, then great. But let's just take a conservative 12% loss 4 times, right, in 20 years. What does that actually do? That actually takes your account down to about $500,000. Now, that's almost half of the $1 million that you were shooting for, right? And the funny thing is if I click this little shuffle button, this shuffle button kind of adjusts when we lose that 12%. And depending on when you lose that 12%, whether it's earlier or later, right? The timing of when you lose that 12% actually changes that number as well. If I click it again, it changes that number again, right? Every time I click that number, it shuffles around when you lose that 12%. And that makes a big impact on your final result. That's under half of what your goal was just because of a few losses in there. Now, let's ask ourselves a couple of questions. What rate of return would be needed? What rate of return would be needed for your account to recover from, to its pre-loss compounding balance of $1 million? So in other words, how much do we have to earn to recover from those 12% losses? Well, the answer is 18.5%. That's what you'd have to earn to kind of recover from each of those losses. Another question to ask yourself is, assuming that your account does earn that 12% per year, which is the highest speculative return, prior to the last year of negative returns, how long will it take to return your account to its pre-loss compounding balance of $1 million? In other words, if you're not going to get an 18% return or 18.5% return, well, maybe you could spend 19 more years actually saving the money to be able to get back to your $1 million goal. Kind of crazy, huh? Well, if we look at a nice little graph here, we can see how that plays out. Okay? When we think about compounding interest, a lot of times we have this in our mind. We just think that that's what's going to happen to our money. The more experience you have, the more you know that sometimes the reality is more like this. The other thing about compounding interest that we haven't even talked about is how taxes play in to the compounding and how the fees pay into the compounding. So as we talk about compound interest and we use different numbers like a 5% average return or a 7 or 8 or whatever number we use, just keep in mind that there's a lot to consider when it comes to actually compounding interest with your money.